Welcome, welcome, my friend, to another episode of the Chasing Poker Greatness podcast. As always, this is your host, the founder of ChasingPokerGreatness.com, Coach Brad Wilson, and we're back. It is Friday, which means it's a very philosophical day. Finally tracked Duncan down from around the world. Welcome back, Duncan. How you been, my friend?
Good to be back, and happy Thanksgiving to everybody.
Yes, very, very happy Thanksgiving. And as before we get into the show, just want to know that going to be another break after this episode for a couple of weeks because things are going on. You know, I got a family in town for Thanksgiving, going out of town for a poker tournament. Duncan's in Japan. Like, just life is coming at us very fast. It's been difficult to get together, but I'm sure that sooner rather than later, we'll be back on our normal weekly Philosophical Friday schedule.
Absolutely. And, sometimes it's okay to prioritize quality over quantity.
There we go. We're going to pretend that that's what we're doing. We're prioritizing quality over quantity. So with all of that in mind, what's on the docket for today's episode of Philosophical Friday?
Right. We were thinking of taking advantage of, the great holiday of Thanksgiving and perhaps talk a little bit, explore a little bit the idea of gratitude. Poker players obviously, fall into a spectrum of very different personalities. But one of the things which, sometimes permeates poker players is the idea of, talking about bad beats, complaining, like do things like that. So we're thinking of basically taking the other side of things and talk a little bit about gratitude. What is gratitude exactly? Is it helpful? How can somebody shift from complaining to perhaps appreciate some things in life? Do we have enough in life to be appreciative of that type of thing? And again, as it pertains to poker, always. So we're gonna start exploring those ideas.
Yeah, and it doesn't just have to be bad beat stories that makes people bad beat stories being the thing that you think of when you think of poker players being ungrateful. I think that something that comes to my mind are just some of the live pros that I've ran into over the years, just being very upset and acting kind of miserable about their lot in life and about their occupation and about how they spend their time and energy. I think you could also just hit the Twitter streets and just say something like, oh, I want to be a professional poker player. And, that's like shining the bat signal for 50 people who are jaded and very upset about playing poker for a living to say, no, don't do it. Do anything other than play poker. Never be a professional poker player. It's the worst thing ever. The worst decision you could ever make. Like, just do anything besides play poker, which, yeah, to me is actually just kind of interesting in and of itself.
Yeah, just leave the fish all to myself, just go do something else. Yeah.
I just, maybe it's just a function of not being in the real world for an extended period of time. But I do remember being 19 years old and working at Applebee's. And I remember specifically it being way worse than any moment when I was a professional poker player for, the last 18 years or so. Like, just poker has given me all of my favorite things in the world, all of my favorite relationships and friendships. And it's just given me a life that I am, eternally grateful for. I can't imagine spending my life force, my energy in another space.
Absolutely. And, we don't like to be cheesy here too much, but that reminded me, sometimes like the grass is always greener on the other side, right? So like you talked about Applebee's. So people, this is human nature. No matter where we are in life, sometimes we're just thinking, what if we were somewhere else in our life? So you're in Applebee's, you say, things could have been better. Now you become not do you specifically. I'm talking about the royal you.
Yeah.
Somebody becomes, a poker player. Oh, what if I did this? What if I had stayed in that other job? Or what if I had that other job, and so on and so forth. But I think what you just did, let me just focus on that for a second. That's exactly what I was hoping we can probe today. What are some things we're grateful for? What are some things that, objectively, when we let ourselves step out for a second and look look ourselves from outside as much as we can, of course. What are some things that we can say, what, in the end of the day, that was a good thing. It could have been much, much worse.
Yeah.
And let me actually, you reminded me of something, and like a heuristic, if you will. Usually we talk about heuristics in the end, but you reminded me just when you said that. Usually when I ask people to evaluate their lives, I give them the following question. If I could give you, a pair of elaborate dice, and I told you, listen, this is your life, you can reroll, right? Imagine that you're playing an RPG on the computer and you can reroll your stats. You can reroll, you can be any person in the world, or you can even be any person in America even, but it can be anybody. I mean, you can be, the president of the United States, all the way to however, you want to think your life, the best and the worst, right? So would you roll that dice?
Of course I wouldn't.
Of course you wouldn't.
And
right?
I would imagine that most of the people on Twitter that say don't play poker professionally would not even touch that dice.
Exactly.
I mean, the reality is, like, poker players get to play a card game for money to pay their way through life, like a game. Right. They play a game for a living. And I mean, to me, it's just really, really funny how much the people who play a game for a living grow to hate their existence for one reason or another. Like, I just can't imagine. Yeah. Like, can you imagine somebody who's miserable as a professional poker player trying to do something else and having like a boss and other responsibility, having to wake up in the morning, like not being able to stay awake late at night, not being able to sleep in, having somebody tell you exactly how you should spend your time and your energy. I think that it's just some kind of elaborate bluff.
Absolutely. And let's actually dive into this a little bit more, right? Because I'm someone who grew up in Greece. So we have a joke in Greece, right? And the joke is we compete for misery, right? That's a little bit of a cultural thing. The joke goes something like this. There was a guy on the street, and his neighbor gets a donkey. So he's like, the proverbial genie or God shows up in his doorstep, and he's like, okay, why are you so miserable? My neighbor got a donkey and I don't have a donkey. All right, and what do you want? Do you want a donkey too? I can, I'm a genie, I can give out to you. No, I just want his donkey to die. So this is like, the proverbial misery. We're competing at the, at family dinners. Thankfully, I'm thankful enough, my family was not like that, but it's a cultural thing, like sitting at a table and we're competing whose life is more miserable. So why don't we just dive in a little bit more into that idea? Why do you think people, they have that attitude? Do you think that they really feel miserable, or do you think that they like the misery? They find some sort of like comfort in misery? Like, if we were to psychoanalyze this, what would you be your take? Like, why do you think people do that? Like, go behind a keyboard and on Twitter and say those things? Or
I don't know. I can, my honest answer is I'm not exactly sure why. I don't know if it's some kind of defense mechanism where, like, while we do play a game for a living, it is a very hard game. And there are periods that are exceptionally stressful and frustrating and soul crushing. And so it could just be a defense mechanism of like, somebody from the outside thinking, oh, you just play poker, you just sit down at your computer and just print money all day, every day. And then being like, no, it's not like that. It's actually quite difficult and very hard, and maybe it's this love of things being hard, or in some like sick, weird way, like just this enjoyment in our own suffering.
Right. So basically giving some sort of worth to the profession by making it sound difficult, and by making it sound, even ugly potentially, because you're saying, what, by accepting that I'm doing something ugly, I'm doing something important, I'm doing something difficult, like some sort of like self-worth, self-defensing, or even venting.
I genuinely, though, I don't know. I just know that if you were to post that on Twitter right now, you would have 100 people saying, go fuck yourself. And if I posted it on Twitter, then,
Oh,
I
yeah.
would have 50 people all telling me that,
Yeah.
I'm just a liar who's trying to get people to buy more courses, and
Sure.
just nobody can make it these days in poker.
Yeah, no, I mean this is really sad. One thing that I want to say, it is important to remember, is sometimes the upset voices are the loudest, and that happens a lot in social media. So a lot of what we see, like a lot of the negativity, still falls into the Pareto principle, like the idea that whatever. 10% of people cause 90% of the problems, or things like that. I don't think poker is different. So there's always going to be people who are loud and complain, and you see them all the time on social media. And there's a lot of people who can potentially fall outside that sort of annoying category.
Sure.
But what do we take it sort of like from the beginning? Yeah, this is an interesting topic, so we can break down a little bit. In your own words, what would you consider gratitude to be? I mean, we usually start with a definition, we end with heuristics. What is your version of gratitude?
My version of gratitude is just, it's being thankful for your life experience, things that are in your orbit in your life, that just assist you and help you on a day-to-day basis.
Very good. And how does that materialize in practical terms? Like, because people can, sit around the fire, the proverbial fire, and say, oh, you know what, I'm grateful for this, I'm grateful for that, which we actually do in Thanksgiving. But on a day-to-day basis, how can somebody, practically speaking, be mindfully thankful of things? Like, how does...
I think firstly, we go about it incorrectly. I think a lot of times, we'll, and I've definitely fallen into the trap of having like a great gratitude journal or something, and just writing 3 things that I'm grateful for every day. While I don't think it's a bad idea, I think that the biggest part of it is you need to feel the gratitude. You need to actually feel the thankfulness. You need to feel the love. It has to do with your central nervous system, and just saying like, oh, I'm grateful for this, but actually not feeling anything. I don't think that's really, what the intention is to feel gratitude. And I mean, if you're struggling, again, the first step to most of these things as it relates to feeling is gaining awareness. And the way that you gain awareness is to sit with yourself through meditation. It's to unplug. It's to get into, the first level of life, which is your consciousness experiencing reality.
Absolutely. And awareness is something that we talked about it. Like it's a step one to a lot of things, right? If we don't understand what is going on, we're not going to be able to resolve it in any way, shape, or form. So awareness is number one. And to add to this, to the concept of awareness, meditation, like you said, an excellent practice. But also for those, for those of us who, perhaps they like to rationalize things, I think it is still important to ask ourselves, okay, if not this, what then? Right? I mean, an honest assessment of life, like the idea, what is the alternative? Okay, so let's say at this point, poker sucks, even some of us may say life sucks, perhaps, right? It's okay. I mean, we're human. We may think there's nothing wrong with the concept of life sucks. What is wrong with, if I may say so myself, what is wrong with saying is the idea that life sucks the way it is, and it couldn't have been, and it couldn't have been worse, right? I mean, that's what I think is the worst part, like the idea of falling ourselves into the pitfall, into the illusion that we really screw the pooch, so to speak, in life, and the things are really bad, and it could have been much better. And I think that's the real issue, like comparatively what it could have been instead, like losing the perspective of what the alternatives could be, right? So
Yeah.
to give you a very crude... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, it's always funny too, that when we do, lose perspective on these things, it's always like the best case scenario of what could have happened, that we're so hard on ourselves about. And, yeah, sorry, I cut you off. You were going to mention an example, I believe.
An example, right? A very crude example, right? The idea of like, when you put it in perspective that there's still people, like close to like 1 billion people not having access to clean water, that puts things in perspective. Now, we have to be very careful. I'm not saying that just because there's people who don't have access to clean water, we should say, oh, you know what, everything in our lives are peachy, and we can explore a little bit of that. But I think it's important, like having that perspective, that the fact alone that we have access to a pod, like if anybody's listening to a pod right now, that probably puts you at the top 10% in the world. Like most people don't have that luxury, like the extra time, to put, just because, in North America or like in other places, this is sort of like a commonality. Most people don't have that type of time, to actually, spare time to engage in those type of activities, right? So that is like perspective is a very important thing. And to your point, what you just said, actually, you're helping my example by a lot. The idea that we always like to see the alternative in the best possible lenses. This is something that happens a lot with social media. I say that to my students all the time. Never, ever, ever make the mistake of comparing yourself to the person who's raising the hand right now in class, because every time there's going to be a different person who's going to raise their hand. So if you're comparing yourself with the person who's raising the hand, you're always going to be behind. That's what happens in social media. You cannot compare yourself to the person who just they binked this tournament. Oh, there's always somebody on social media. They binked this tournament. They did that. And what am I doing with my life? You're always comparing yourself with the person, the play du jour, so to speak, like the person who's successful today, and then tomorrow is going to be somebody else who's successful, and somebody else who's successful. You can't always the changing person who's at the top comparing yourself to. That's not that person keeps changing. It's not a real person, like the thing that's, the topic du jour is not reality. It's just, the highlights of the entire society. You cannot compare yourself to the highlights of the entire society. Right.
Yeah. I think oftentimes it's really hard to visualize things like, how do I phrase this? So it's difficult visualizing our lives altered in a way that we don't think about. So clinical depression, for instance, that's a thing that can be debilitating, and it's a chemical imbalance in your brain. And I mean, it can be lifelong detriment. It's just a very, very challenging issue. K.L. Cleaton, he's in a wheelchair, and he's a quadriplegic, and I mean, this was from birth. It's not as if he chose for that to happen. It's a thing that happened, right? And so, like, most likely someone who's listening to this, you're driving in your car, you're at the gym, you're on a walk, all of these things, like, we don't have to be able to walk. It's not like a given in our lives. You mentioned clean water. It not even a given in our lives that, we have electricity, that we have technology, that we have all of these things that just many generations have never had or could never dream about. And in 1,000 years ago, the things that we have, we would be kings of the entire world. So I think a lot of times we look at what we don't have. We look at ways that we could be better. We look at, we lose a tournament. We just imagine ourselves winning the tournament. And we just don't see that, like, a lot of us, we just have a lot to be grateful for on a day-to-day basis. Things that we kind of take for granted in this quest to progress through our lives.
Absolutely. And you reminded me of something very important. You mentioned basically a temporal comparison. It's not only things that we have compared to other people who are alive today, it's also things that we have compared to all those who have existed over time, right?
Sure.
So, like, that's another thing too. Like, again, we can roll the dice not only geographically, but we can roll the dice temporally, namely living in any other area in time. I mean, any other, time location. And the fun part is, I don't think anybody would want to take their chances of being, a caveman, or like living in the Middle Ages, or even 100 years ago when there was segregation and like things were tough for a lot of people. So it's just
yeah. And again, the reason why we're so afraid to roll the dice is because we have a lot to be grateful for. Right, that exactly. There's no other way to spin it. It's just, if you had nothing to be grateful for, if every second of every day was misery, right, you would instantly roll the dice because you would have a lot of incentive to roll the dice.
Absolutely, absolutely, and yeah, and uh, don't get me wrong. I mean, I'm sure there are some people who, their lives, there are very, very miserable. But I've also met a lot of people who, even though they have actually things to really, like the example you just brought, right? Like quadriplegic people, like people who have a lot of things to legitimately complain about, and they find the strength. You've mentioned Viktor Frankl in the past, right? I mean, the search for meaning. Like, so there's people who find meaning in under the craziest of circumstances, right? And to me, this is something which is commendable at the very least, and we can learn from these people.
Yeah, and
And
I think meaning is the operative word, right? Like a lot of us who, I think a lot of folks who are unhappy with their lot in life, a lot of times don't have meaning, don't have fulfillment, don't have something that like gets them out of bed that they can work towards on a daily basis.
right,
And yeah, I could see how that could lead to a lot of downstream unhappiness and unfulfillment and regret as to how you spend your time on a minute to minute basis.
great. Great, because this is also a great segue to what I wanted to ask you next. I mean, what are some pitfalls of forgetting or regretting in general? Like, what is some pitfalls of forgetting to be grateful for things? Talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so I believe that I am a type A achiever, right? Like I like getting things done. I like taking on big projects that make me feel like death and hate everything while I'm in the middle of them. And I think that for someone like me, I can always focus on what is yet to come. I can always focus on the next project. I can always focus on the next launch, the next thing that needs to be done with my business, the next project to take on as it relates to the podcast, to the Wolf program, just to all the different projects that I have going on in my life. And if I don't sit down and express gratitude and really recognize, like, compare myself to myself from a year ago, right? It's like, wow, like a lot of progress has been made. I think that we kind of forget all the things that we accomplish over time unless we kind of think about it and think like, wow, actually 1 year ago, the Wolf program hadn't even launched yet. And me and Shu and John were essentially working on building out the strats, working on all of our processes, and now just an unthinkable amount of work has been done over the past year. We have just hundreds and hundreds of hours of coaching sessions, of training. We've built out our processes very cleanly. People, Wolves can join and get onboarded pretty much on their own these days. And the Wolves are moving up stakes. They're having a decent win rate, at the stakes that they're playing. I mean, so all of these things are things that I'm grateful for. They're past goals that have been completed in the past year, right? And maybe that's part of it, right? Like just not taking the time to savor checking that box of like, oh, I was trying to accomplish this thing and I did. And just savoring that completion, just taking a beat, because most of the time you just check the box and you move on to the next box. You never even think about the box that you just checked. So like for me, yeah, I think if I forget to be grateful, if I forget to, just savor these accomplishments, the goals that I check off, then I feel burned out. I feel overwhelmed. I feel sad. I feel like I'm just stuck in the mud and I'm not progressing forward at all because there's just always an unlimited amount of items on my to-do list that I still have to get done. So for me personally, that's the big downside of forgetting to be grateful, forgetting to savor accomplishing projects.
Absolutely. And if I were to reframe what you just said in slightly different language that you and I have discussed before, essentially the danger you're describing is getting perpetually stuck in the proximity principle, right? In what actually happens in the here and now, and forget what the progress is over time, right? Because what you're describing right now, the progress over time, is something that you have to, again, step away from the now for a second, right? And see the graph, the whole graph, because when you are generating the graph in the moment, you cannot see any slope. You cannot see the graph going up. You cannot see the graph going down. I mean, you can think you can see it, but if you cannot step away from the graph to actually see how it looked a year ago, how it looked, 10 years ago, how it looked, down the line, we cannot gain that perspective. So we're stuck in that proximity principle, right? I mean, the idea that the only thing that our brains want to spend energy on is what's happening right here, right now. And I don't necessarily mean the right here, right now in the mindfulness kind of way. I'm talking about in the vicinity of our time. We don't necessarily have to be mindful to do this.
Right. I mean, I also am the type of person that will have contempt for my past self. I think that's something that, like, I'll listen or revisit something that I made a year and a half ago, and I'm like, this could have been done so much better. Like, what was I thinking? And a lot of times what I find is that having contempt for my past self, who was trying to accomplish and learn and grow and all of these things, is that there are things that I used to know that were actually quite applicable and quite valuable that I kind of progressed beyond through studying mass data. I was a winning poker player for well over a decade before I even figured out and saw the possibilities of data analysis as it relates to playing poker, right? So it's very easy for me to have contempt for myself, or for myself that didn't have any data analysis as a poker player, because what a dummy. Like, look, how are you even making decisions while you were playing poker? How did you even win? Because you knew so little. But there are things that I was doing that were very, very, very good that allowed me to be a winning poker player that I kind of forgot about or kind of got overwritten in what I've learned over the past year. So yeah, I find it easy to have contempt for my past self. And I'm also surprised when I think of a concept that I used to apply regularly, and I'm like, why did I stop doing that? Why did I stop teaching that? That was actually quite a powerful concept. So yeah, just again, I'm very hard on myself. I think this is the takeaway for the listener is I'm very hard on any past inaccuracies, any past lack of knowledge, lack of progress, all of these things. But yeah, I think just again, being grateful to make progress, being grateful for what got me in this position in the first place and the type of human that I was. Yeah, all of this is just healthy for me. It just gives me room to breathe, room to be like, I'm happy with my life. I'm happy with the decisions that I've made. I'm happy with what led me to this point as, a coach, a poker player, a husband, etc.
Absolutely. And this is what I like to call the curse of the overachiever, right? Of the novel, right? You are basically, if you constantly trying different things, you're cursed to think that some of them become obsolete, because again, you are in the path of progress and you get to see newer and newer and newer things. But the fact of the matter is that some of the newer things wouldn't even exist if you didn't have, the Edison principle, if you didn't have all the quote unquote failed attempts of the past to bring you to the new stuff, right? So it's remarkable how overachievers can actually do that, and it's an excellent thing. I think it's interesting to be introspective about it, to think about it. And I know a lot of people who actually are listening, they may fall into that category, right? I mean, we all are in the sort of like the process of trying to improve ourselves one way or another. That's why we may be listening to a podcast like this, right? Or similar podcasts like that, because I mean, we're listening our own podcast as well. So it's a constant process of improvement, but improvement doesn't necessarily mean, to your point, Brad, I just want to illustrate that point because very clear, to be clear for the listener, improvement doesn't mean we throw away the past, right? No matter how crude it was at some point, it doesn't mean we just completely say, what an idiot I was. Improvement means, I was in step 1, now I'm in step X, whatever it may be. So we just have to put everything in sort of like a perspective, the whole picture.
And to be fair, like if you don't look back at yourself a year or 2 years ago and see what is a different human, with just very different belief systems, with very different way they go about approaching life, where very different way that they go about, in our space, playing poker, learning, growing, you're probably just not growing enough, right? Like you're not actively pushing yourself to be a different person. And to me, like that really is one of my core values is progression. I like progressing. I like learning. I like overriding ideas that I previously had that are or were subpar. It's just a valuable part of my life experience. But yeah, it can it can be quite brutal on the inside.
For sure, it can be quite brutal on the inside. But at the same time, some of these ideas that you call subpar wouldn't make your current ideas possible if they didn't exist. And
most of them, because like you have to, so just a anecdotal story here.
Please.
We have a few days during the week where we call them strat days, where me, John, and Shu will build strategies for the wolves. We'll do data analysis. We'll bounce ideas back and forth, and sometimes a wolf or two will sit in on these meetings, the strat development meetings, right? And I don't know exactly how they imagine or how the listener right now is imagining these meetings kind of going. But if you were to look at it outside, like a fly on the wall, you'd be like, wow, it's a shit show. They have like many different directions. It's like they're just all over the place, right? And the reality, like that's what progression looks like.
That's
like
right.
It's just messing around in the sandbox and trying to figure out how all these things work together and make sense of things that currently don't make sense. And it's very messy and it's very dirty. There's not like a systematic progression of like, oh, Brad, John, and Chu are going to get together and this is what they're going to do. And this is the output. It's just, a session that it's not streamlined. It's there's a lot of dirty work. There's a lot of bad ideas that happen before the good ideas can fall into place.
Absolutely. And let me just say that if it wasn't dirty like that, you wouldn't need it in the first place, right? I mean, that's the whole point of the brainstorming. And again, just, a lot of bad ideas. Once again, this is the curse of the novel. You cannot get good ideas unless you have a lot of terrible ones, right? So like a lot of innovative people, the more innovative somebody is, the more terrible ideas they have. It's impossible to generate good ideas without the bad ones. And the metaphor that the scientific metaphor one can give, there is a very nice metaphor that Richard Dawkins gives in his I'm paraphrasing, of course, in the Selfish Gene, like an excellent book on biology. So basically, the metaphor is that the way evolution works in very broad strokes is that a lot of accidental mutations happen to the genome. That is, things by accident change on our DNA. And when I say our, I mean all the species, not just humans. And then most of these changes are lethal, as you can imagine, right? Because if something changes in your genetic code, that means you may not be as capable of finding food as easily, you may not be as capable of reproducing, and so on and so forth. But once in a blue moon, and when I say once in a blue moon, I mean once in a billion, like very rarely, some of these mutations, right? Some of these changes, genetic mutations, actually end up helping us, right? So for example, in an island where the food is really high up, animals with longer neck will be able to find it. And that may have happened with just some mutation that happened accidentally. So the point is, change that is beneficial is very rare. And the same is true with good ideas. Good ideas are one in a million. So this is a point that I didn't realize until sort of like that point reading Dawkins, right? We need the terrible ideas. That's very important. We need all this nonsense that we have to live with. I mean, I have to live with myself, right? I mean, I have to live with my nonsense all the time, right? And it's a lot of nonsense, right? So you heard it here, folks. You know, this part is we have to live with all of that nonsense, because otherwise there can be a gem in the rough. Like, and I call it the Edison principle, because Thomas Edison famously has, you know, in that interview, you know, like, how do you feel that finally, after 1,000 failed attempts, you created the light bulb, right? He was like, 1,000 failed attempts. I know 1,000 ways that the light bulb doesn't work. What the hell do you know, right? So I know this is like a meme at this point in this pod, but these 1,000 failed attempts are important. We gotta have the sucky ideas, like all this mess that you're describing in a brainstorm meeting. That's beautiful. That's like, that's awesomeness wait to happen. You know, that's a beautiful thing, not ugly.
And tying this back into gratitude, right? Like, life is an iterative process, and since the beginning of time, you know, that's the way that it must be.
Right.
And you know, I think that while genetic mutations are rare, it's very clear that there have been many of them across the globe that have helped life sustain over time, right? That they've optimized for life. And as a human being, there are many different ways that you're optimized for life, right? Through all of these various iterations. You know, this is just a gift from past human beings that we enjoy today. I think that just maybe a month or so ago, me and my wife were looking at child mortality rates just 200 years ago.
Right.
And in like 1800, it was a flip for your kid to make it to be older than 5, like a true coin flip. 50% of children died before the age of 5, right? And that's just an insane thing to consider 200 years later. But through iteration, through learning, through science, through medical advancement, we've progressed to where, you know, just Duncan, me or you, it's a flip as to which one of us is going to make it to not adulthood, but to enjoy our childhood.
Absolutely. It's funny that you mentioned that, because I know for a fact I wouldn't have made it if I was born 150 years ago. I know that, because like, I had a very serious disease when I was about 1. I mean, it was like a fever, but it was serious for somebody, like very high fever for a young child like that. If I didn't have the proper medical care that I did get when I was about not even a year, or I was like a couple months old, I had a very serious fever that I wouldn't have survived if it wasn't 100 years ago, if we didn't have like the
and I'm effectively blind without contacts and any form of like assistance. So God only, I have no idea how I would make it through the world if I didn't have a way to assist my vision. I just think that these are, again, things to be grateful for. Contacts, modern medicine that, you know, allowed you to even make it to this point in your life that you're experiencing right now. Adaptations, iterations, biological, just the way that the birds interact with the flowers, the way that trees operate. Just, there's so many things that we just take for granted, you know, and the sun comes out, it rains. We get sad when it rains, when effectively it's life, right? Like as the rain is pouring down on us, that's the building block of life. So being grateful for all of these things that we naturally experience, feeling it in our hearts, I think is quite important, and just, very beneficial to living or having an existence that's bearable.
Absolutely. And just to clarify also for the listener, you know, this is not a suggestion to be Pollyannas, so to speak, right? I mean, to forget, you know, the bad things that happen in the world or in your life and throw them under the rug, right? I mean, it's just an objective sort of way of evaluating life, which sort of brings me to another question, another practical question. When is it okay, you know, to temporarily focus on tangible issues that happen in our lives, right? Because our lives are not perfect. Like, there's definitely things that need to be improved. So there is, you know, a natural question. Somebody says, okay, so should I sit back at all times and think, oh, you know what, my life is so great, you know, it could have been much, much worse, and therefore do nothing about it? So when is it okay, to you understand where this is going? Because
I see what you're saying.
people like to
And
take it too far. So when is it okay to concentrate on the problems of life, and what would be the best way to go
yeah,
about it?
so I'm actually going to reject the premise of the question.
Mm-hmm.
Because as human beings, I think we're hardwired to focus on those sort of things.
Okay.
I don't think that like we can just be like, oh, yep, everything's great. I'm grateful for everything. Now I'm just not going to think about
Okay.
the things in my space. I think that just naturally we're hardwired to think about that. We're hardwired to analyze risk in our life. I think that's just part of our biology. I don't think we're necessarily hardwired to focus on how things could have been in a different age, how things could have been if just one piece of your life were just a little bit different. So yeah, I think that people will always think about the things that are bothering them. They will always stress out. They'll always be anxious, and that's just again a part of the human experience in the year of 2022. But yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. I mean,
Sure.
maybe you have a different take. I just think that like there's nobody listening to this that's like, yep, my life is happy now. I'm just not going to worry about my house going into foreclosure or my kids eating dinner tonight. I'm good.
Right. I was referring mostly. No, that's a very good point. But I was referring mostly to the Van Wilders of the world, so to speak. I don't know if you remember. That's like for
I
for
do.
for,
I do.
for Bruins. That's a very very big movie for us, especially when we were kids. The idea that worrying is like rocking a chair, right? It gives you something to think about, but it takes you nowhere, right? So I was talking about this type of mentality, which is a joke that there are some people who may say, what, this is not something I want to worry about, right? Because and it's perhaps a way of pushing a problem away, not so much as like not so much a transcendence, not so much a, oh, what, now I found the happiness, but it is the happiness in life, but it's more of a, I'm pushing a problem away because what, I'm happy, everything is peachy. So it could be more pathological, if you will. I see what you're saying,
Yeah.
that will always be, but I'm talking about
I just don't even think
the over optimists.
I don't know that like that's a thing, right? Where I think that mostly when people are pushing these things away, they're just living in fear of facing them. They're living in fear of approaching and resolving these problems, which is stressful and causes anxiousness. I think that they're just ignoring whatever problem it is, or doing their best to. I mean, I guess maybe there are just sociopaths that just go through their life and cause chaos and don't ever think about anybody but themselves. But I would imagine that that's quite rare. And to me, like, I can't imagine that kind of life being one of happiness and fulfillment where you're just not holding yourself accountable to your responsibilities. Right. You're not doing the things that, the people who are around you would benefit from. You're just, being totally selfish and not helpful to anyone. I mean, I don't know that anything that I would say to them would even matter anyway, just based on how they are,
Right. So you've never like you've never experienced somebody you would call an over optimist, like somebody who is like always looking at the glass half full to the point that they could be hurting themselves?
I don't know. I mean, I guess maybe like from a sense of like younger people who are potentially delusional about
right.
what they're going to do. I think, that's a big concern. But I mean, look, I've been young and I've been delusional.
Right.
And the only way that I worked through
I'm still delusional.
that I'm sure I am too, right? I'm sure that 5 years from now, I'll look back and be like, wow, what a freaking delusional version of Brad that was on Philosophical Friday. But again, like life is messy, and working your way through those delusions is just part of the growing process. And I think that without that delusion, I probably never would have started chasing poker greatness. I probably never would have started any of these projects that I've started that have been exceptionally difficult. I think that before I made my first website, it was like make a website in 20 whatever year it was, and it's like, okay, so like how much are we going to charge for this e-commerce product, right? Like this is a very big deal because as soon as the site goes live, there's going to be a million people that just are automatically going to buy everything that we have. So all of this needs to be perfect. And then you get done setting up your Shopify website and you realize that, oh no, nobody's ever going to visit your website ever in a million years. Nobody can ever find it. You're like, oh wow, I have to like market. I have to like find demand. And I think, that's just, you start with a problem, right? And the first problem was you don't have a website. So you resolve that problem. And then you realize like, oh shit, now I don't have traffic. How do I get traffic? Oh my God, nobody wants to buy what I'm selling. So I actually need a good product. And like, you don't have visibility of these problems without the delusion that you just make a website and everybody comes, right? So maybe a little delusion is helpful. It's a catalyst to dive into the messiness that is, creation, learning, and growth.
Absolutely. Even delusion and even arrogance, as long as it's not meta arrogance, I would agree with you 100%. Like, we don't necessarily know where to put the needle. So we might as well, just make those mistakes, get out there and make those mistakes. But let me rephrase the question, because perhaps like you said, maybe the question is not properly asked. So let me try a different approach. What would you say to those who really actively are trying to be grateful about their lives, and when a problem occurs, they feel guilty about that problem that occurs? Like I have that with my students, like all the time. They're like, Duncan, I know I shouldn't be complaining. Like I know I have all these things. My parents are wealthy. Like everything's going well in my life, but like I feel stuck. Here, like I cannot make progress, and they sort of like start to generate that guilt for feeling, like, why am I complaining? I have everything in life, and yet, my life is, in some sort of like temporary stagnation. That's sort of like the picture that I had in mind, right? Because we still have to resolve issues as they, how do people, is that maybe a better question to ask?
No, I mean, okay. It's, to me, it's okay. It's okay to feel that way. I think that's quite a normal feeling, and we feel guilt over having these thoughts and having these feelings, but the reality is that you feel the way you feel, and I think that just ought to be okay. You just experience that as long as it takes, and then that's that, right? Like that to me is just, it's a standard part of the human experience. If I could use the metaphor that I know I've used before, but Path of Exile, we're both fans of the game. One thing in Path of Exile that I realized while I was playing, I didn't even realize it, but I was like, I'm slaying all these monsters. I'm crawling through all these dungeons, slaying all these monsters because I'm trying to progress. I'm trying to level up. I'm trying to get gear so that, I can be more powerful. And I realized at one point, while I'm working my way through this dungeon, I'm like, I gotta just make it through this dungeon so that I can get out of this dungeon. And like, no, the dungeon is what's fun about the game, right? It's the challenge. The dungeon is like
the journey.
It's the journey. It's what's exciting about being a part of it. But I wasn't happy while I was slaying the monsters and going through the dungeon. It was all about, I just, I need to get this gear. I need to get that. I need to level up. I need to solve this problem, that problem, this problem, this problem. And you just forget to have fun doing the thing that you're leveling up for in the first place. And that's, to be able to go through more dungeons. So to me, that's just a part of life, is that, a lot of times we can feel unhappy. We can feel like, I'm doing this, going to work, trying to save money to buy this, pay this off, need to upgrade this, etc. But the reality is like, you're going through you're in the dungeon right now. You're experiencing life. It's hard. Sometimes it's frustrating. It's challenging. But that's what this is. This whole life experience is going through this seemingly frustrating times. And I think that you just have to honor that. You have to recognize, like, yeah, I'm not digging this right now. I'm not digging battling through these issues that I'm experiencing in life. And that's okay, because no matter what, there's always people out there who have more, who are doing more, who are more successful, who are also feeling bad about their lives and their existence on this planet at this very moment. And so to your students, I would say it's okay.
Right.
You just don't punish yourself for feeling this way. It's a natural part of the human experience. Feel the way that you feel. And I think that, yeah, that's just a thing that I wish I would have focused on in my life more, of like, yeah, you feel sad right now, and it's okay. You're not weak for feeling sad. You're not weak for feeling crushed. You're not weak for feeling like you don't even know if you want to get out of bed. It's a part of your life experience.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, to summarize some of those things, like, awareness is at the very bottom of it. First of all, be aware of it. And second of all, would be acceptance. Accept that feeling, it's okay to have it. And then there will be a third step, which will tie to take action, by accepting that it is okay, and the fact that, you are dealing with the proximity principle. It's affecting you right now. The proximity principle is affecting you. It doesn't matter how good your life is. If you have a toothache, that toothache is going to be more important than anything else in your life at that point, because it's near where you are in space and time. So that's very important. So you have to take action on that specific thing. And then to your other point, that it's the sort of like another cheesy thing. It's the journey, not the destination. It's funny that you mentioned that, because Andrew Huberman is talking about that. The professor at Stanford is talking about that, about the brain chemistry, the way that our brain works. That if we actually associate reward at the end of a specific mission, like you're describing right now with Path of Exile, right? I mean, I need to finish farming this dungeon, because at the end I'm going to get a piece of gear, right? So we are basically putting the gratification, and I don't mean delayed gratification in the psychological sense people are using it today, but we're putting the gratification after the task. I have to finish it in order to get the reward. The way the brain chemistry works, and actually Andrew Huberman describes it perfectly with dopamine, is that our body becomes very, 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 very desensitized and disinterested. Our brain becomes disinterested because they know there's not going to be any dopamine release during the activity itself. So they actually would become sad and miserable during the activity, because the body knows we're not going to release any dopamine, because the dopamine is coming later. So by delaying the reward, by not actually making the act of doing things the reward itself, and by saying, listen, no, this is not the reward comes later, we actually hurting ourselves, right? And the metaphor he's using, of David Goggins. David Goggins is a good example, because David Goggins doesn't work out because he wants to get buff, doesn't work out because he wants to get faster, doesn't work out because he wants to be healthier. He works out because he loves the moment he's working out, right? I mean, he likes the moment of suffering in the then and there. And this is also can be explained. So as a next step, right? Again, we started awareness, then acceptance, then take action, but take action in a way where the journey is what we like, not the destination, in the sense that the journey is its own reward. We're rewarding our brain. And of course, that takes meditation, that takes practice. But it's still important to understand that, like saying, listen, I'm doing something for my later years. I'm doing something for retirement. I'm playing this game that I really hate. Perhaps that because I really to make some money is the wrong way to go about it, right? What we should be doing, like, we're not doing this pod for reasons. We're doing this pod because we like it. We like to discuss those things, and it's its own reward. So it has to be in some way or another. What you just said about the Path of Exile, it has to be its own reward. The dungeon has to be its own reward one way or another. Find a way to be its own reward, because if it isn't, you're actually essentially causing misery to yourself by the way the chemistry works.
Yep. And I've found that all the things that I've been most successful at in life are things that I do without prompting. the Wolf program for the past year.
Right.
I'll have 5 things on my to-do list and wake up, get on my computer, and have just some random idea about a spot that I want to analyze. And then 2 hours later, I've built out a strat upgrade. And because I like doing it, I know that it has a tangible effect on, people who have trusted in me to help facilitate a poker career a long time into the future. And I take that quite seriously, and it makes me happy doing these things. So the podcast is a thing that I do because I love doing it. Me and John recorded a Tactical Tuesday today. I know I'm breaking the law here of podcasts. Sometimes these things are not recorded on the day of the actual release. And now I'm recording this episode with you. It's 6 p.m. on a Sunday, and it's dark outside. And, there are a million things that I could be doing, but I enjoy doing this, and I'm grateful that I'm here. And I just know that when I do things because I love doing them, because they give me value, they give me fulfillment, I tend to do a much better job.
What a wonderful way to I think, like, I had some questions, but I'm like, you know what? This is a wonderful way to end the conversation, right? It's the penultimate gratitude, like we're doing this because, again, we like it. And I think, it's something that comes across too. Sometimes, before we start the pod, I mean, the listeners doesn't know that, but we start engaging in a conversation ourselves. It's like, maybe we should be recording this, but that's how it is. If you're not willing to have that conversation outside of the mic, I mean, probably you shouldn't be having it when the mic is on.
Oh, me and John probably record 4 Tactical Tuesdays before we ever even record our one. We get before we met today. I did a poker coaching play and explain last night, and we looked at like 15 or 20 hands that went down during that poker coaching play and explain. And we didn't talk about them on Tactical Tuesday. We just looked at the hands because we were both very interested and loved discussing poker strategy. So yeah, and to wrap this episode of Philosophical Friday up, I'm very grateful that I have people like you and John in my life that I enjoy speaking with on a regular basis. That's, it's a blessing and not something that I've had in large parts of my life experience. And so I'm just eternally grateful. And so thank you. Thank you to the listener spending their time listening to you and I have these conversations. And I guess, we'll close out by prompting the listener to go subscribe on Duncan's YouTube, youtube.com/whyalexbeatsbobby. Ask the Math Doctor on Twitter, if Twitter still exists next week. We'll see. It's up in the air right now. At CPG Podcast, and greatnessvillage.com to hop in the village. Talk to me and Duncan. And,
absolutely. And thank you everybody for actually joining us. Thank you everybody for your comments, sharing the stories. I know I received personally a lot of messages from people. Thank you. Honestly, really, thank you. I mean, this podcast wouldn't exist without people, interacting and, saying their stories, their amazing stories, the comments, questions, objections, or comments, as I like to call them, all of them are welcome, so thank you very much for being an active member of the community. And again, if there's anything else, feel free to reach out in all of these places, and you have a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful long weekend.
Yep. And we'll see you in a few weeks whenever we get back, me and Duncan get in better coordination. It's tough. It's tough. That's these days.
Life is difficult.
Life is difficult.
But it doesn't suck.
See you next time.